a quote from Pope Benedict XV, not the 16th, but the last Pope Benedict, which was around World War I. And he made the following observation. He said, quote, "It's our will that Catholics should abstain from certain labels which have been brought into use to distinguish one group of Catholics from another. They are to be avoided as out of harmony with the truth, but also because they give rise to great trouble and confusion among Catholics. Such is the nature of Catholicism that does not admit of more or less, but must be held as a whole, or wholly rejected. There is no need of adding any qualifying terms to the profession of Catholicism. It is quite enough for each one to proclaim, 'Christian is my name and Catholic my surname.' Only let him endeavor to be in reality that what he calls himself." End quote. That was from Ad Beatissimi Apostolorum 24. And the purpose of what he's saying is that if we're all Catholic, if we're all in good standing with the Church, there's no need for further labels. I'm here to talk about traditional Catholicism, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, and starting with this citation because I don't want to give the impression that we are talking about some different sect or a group of Catholics. We're all Catholics. We're all in union with Rome. But that's a fitting point of departure. My talk is about tradition in the life of the Church and understanding its proper role, and why, in my humble opinion, Catholic tradition provides the most promising means of restoration of faith in the world today. So we're not talking about a sect of traditionalists or radical traditionalists, as Dave will call them sometimes, but just Catholicism, its historical fullness. Now, Catholicism, as we all know, Christianity, it's a historical religion. It makes claims about events that happen in human history, that a particular time and place, a certain man walked this earth, and that man was the incarnate Word of God, and that he actually lived and did miracles and was crucified during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and that he rose from the dead, and that real people saw him and testified to his resurrection, and that he founded a church to perpetuate his ministry throughout all time, and that this church still exists and teaches with his authority. In the New Testament, St. Paul tells Timothy to guard something called the paratheke. I'm not good at Greek, I'm sorry. The paratheke, which is the deposit. This is the famous deposit of faith that the Second Vatican Council talks about, and that it says in the book of St. Jude that we are to guard, that was once and for all delivered to the saints. The Second Vatican Council says that the deposit of faith is everything that the Church believes, lives, and is. It is the Church's identity that's handed on. Now, when we talk about tradition in a broad sense, I know in apologetics we tend to distinguish between tradition and Scripture, as different modes of revelation, but in a broad sense, tradition from the Latin traditio is just everything that's handed on. It's those things that are handed down. Everything in that deposit. So if you understand it in a broad sense, everything is tradition. Even the Bible is a tradition. This is a good thing to point out when you speak to Protestants. That Bible didn't drop from heaven, in its total canonical form. The Church assembled it based on the custom of its usage in the churches in the ancient world. So understood in a broad sense, even the Bible is a tradition. Everything we have is something that's handed on. Now, we're all familiar, I think, with tradition as a mode of how something is handed on. We've contrasted it with things in writing versus things not in writing. It's a mode of transmission. But I think it's a good point to meditate on that tradition isn't only a way of handing something on, it actually constitutes its own, it has its own content. Tradition is not merely a way of passing something on, it's what they call constitutive also. It has its own things in tradition, its own contents, right? There's a really neat book. Dave probably has it somewhere in here, but there's a neat book called Tradition in the Church by Monsignor George Agius. It's published by Tan Books, and Monsignor Agius was probably, I think this was published in 1928. It's probably the most very deepest exposition of tradition that has come out of the 20th or 21st century. He notes that the core of the Church's constitutive tradition, there's all sorts of things that come in that tradition, but he says, what is at the core of that constitutive tradition? He says it's our sacred liturgy. It's in our sacred liturgy that it's in her worship that all of these unwritten traditions, all that the church is, that it lives, that it breathes, all these things kind of coalesce together in the church's sacred liturgy. And this is why maybe you've met Catholics who seem excessively hung up on the liturgy. I've been one of those at some points. It's a failing sometimes to be too nitpicky about that. But there's a reason why that Catholics who want to defend our tradition, why they draw the line at the liturgy as the special object of their attention, and why you may have noticed that those bent on the destruction of the Catholic faith, the liturgy becomes the special object of their attack as well. I'm presuming you've witnessed what I'm talking about or know what I mean. This is the point where all kind of the issues up in the air about the church and its role in the world come into play is in the liturgy, and people will make the liturgy into, try to change it certain ways or try to defend it from a point of view of tradition. But at any rate, the liturgy is ground zero, really, because that is the place where all the constitutive tradition kind of comes together. Now, I mentioned those bent on destruction of the Catholic faith. Now, of course, the Catholic faith can't be destroyed. The gates of hell will never prevail against it. But it's evident to any objective observer, I think, that the church in the Western world is in a state of crisis. I have all sorts of depressing statistics we could go through, but I think we know them. Drops in ordination, drops in 80% of Catholics disbelieving in the real presence, or statistics on acceptance of the church's teaching on artificial contraception. This one was pretty amazing that in 1965 in the United States there was only 338 annulments granted in the whole country, and by 2002 there was 50,000 annulments. So all sorts of things. Of 2/3 of the seminaries that were open in 1965 have closed. So these are external indicators of Catholicism. I know Pope Benedict says he thinks in the church in the future we may have a church that's smaller but more vibrant, right? And that certainly looks to be the way we're going. So these are just external indicators of the church's, vitality in society. Keep in mind this data, a lot of it is 13 years old, and the situation may be worse in European countries, which are a little bit more advanced in the kind of cultural degeneration. Priestless parishes, it's a fairly interesting number. In 1965, only 1% of parishes were without a priest. Today in America, there's 3,000 priestless parishes, which is an increase from 1% to 15% of all parishes are priestless. So this is the progressive revolution played out in the church. Now, I consider myself a traditional Catholic, but as I said, that's not like a sect or something. But I think the degree to which one, at least for me, is a traditional Catholic or not depends on what you do with that data, how one interprets it, what is behind the disastrous decline, and what can be done about it. So people interpret data differently. What really strikes me is that progressives or people who dislike Catholic tradition will say this collapse is actually due to the fact that the revolution hasn't gone far enough, that what we need is more liberalization, more liturgical experimentation, more rupture. The key to the failures of revolution is always more revolution, right? That's an astounding position to me, but I see people take it. We've messed with all this stuff for all these years. People are leaving the church. If we just messed with it more, then this would stop. If we just do more revolution. But other faithful Catholics tend to interpret the data as a result of a disastrous liberal infiltration into the church's thinking. I posit that like I said, I have a lot in common with Dave, but we disagree on other things. One item that I disagree on with other faithful Catholics is the degree to which is the church being infiltrated by liberal ideas, or is the church itself, the hierarchy, and sometimes complicit with it? Now, I'm not going to talk about that because I promised Dave I wouldn't. But But I think that's an interesting point. What, if this is all going on, where does Rome stand in it? Is Rome fighting it heroically? Is it sometimes facilitating it? People argue about this. At the very least, I would say that the fact that good Catholics who are relatively educated can disagree so vehemently about it suggests that maybe there's mixed messages. But at any rate, I started turning towards a more traditional expression of Catholicism the day that I realized that the abuses that I'm talking about were not just here and there in this parish or that parish, but they were everywhere. They were almost in every parish. I say almost because some of us go to Grotto or some of us go to places where it's not happening. But these are little island sanctuaries. They're little sanctuaries that often depend on the presence of one priest. At Old St. Pat's, we have a great liturgy. We have the Novus Ordo, and then we have the traditional Latin Mass once a month. And Father Goronsky is a very good priest. And I think you've been invited to our parish, Dr. Fastigi. You've given talks. You know Father Goronsky.
He was my student.
Ah,
Oh, wow.
we'll talk later. No, well, but it's a great parish and it's a great atmosphere and we feel safe there. But the fact is, its continuation depends on the presence of that one priest. If he were to leave and someone else come in that simply didn't share his outlook, the whole thing could collapse. We'd be driving to Grotto or to somewhere else until Father Perone, passed on or got transferred somewhere, and then I don't know. So it's very tenuous. And the day I started thinking in terms of traditional Catholicism was when I realized that was the situation, that the problems weren't just in a couple parishes, but they were fairly ubiquitous, and it's very fragile. But the real question for any faithful Catholic is not what's wrong. We can all go nuts pointing out what's wrong, but what we should be doing right. I remember, sometimes you go to Mass when you're on vacation. You go to somewhere you don't normally go, and you walk into something, and you wonder what you walked into, And I was in a Mass one time, and I remember praying and thinking, it doesn't seem to be reverent or whatever, and I felt the Holy Spirit tell me, if you don't think it's reverent, then you be reverent, If you think there's a lack of holiness, you be holy, And it really reoriented my mind from just simply like this and this and this and all this stuff is wrong and I'm just in total despair, to that the kingdom of God is within you, and if I'm concerned about the purification and the restoration of the church, should strive for my own salvation first, and then that will help everybody else, right? And that's really been like a very profound revelation for me. The church is always in need of purification, but how do we facilitate that purification within ourselves and our communities? Now, I'm a student of history, and I'm fairly convinced that any idea can only maintain its vitality by returning to the roots of its own tradition, the fount of its origin. We see this continually in the history of the church. Whenever there's been a religious order that started to go astray, they would go back to the spirit of the founder, go back to the spirit of Benedict, or back to the spirit of St. Francis. Whatever that founding ideal was that gave the original impetus, that's what they would go back to. Renaissances in the golden age of Thomistic theology that was ushered in by Pope Leo XIII with his great encyclical Aeterni Patris, where he said our theology needs to go back to St. Thomas, and then it ushered in this great golden age in the first half of the 20th century. Our country isn't that old. Many of you probably traveled to Europe and seen the beautiful old architecture, but the most beautiful buildings in the United States, like St. Joseph's in Detroit or St. Josephat, Sweetest Heart of Mary, Old St. Patrick's, these are all built in a style called the Gothic Revival, which was where they were going back to the classical period of cathedral architecture from the Middle Ages. So that was a return to the font. So again and again throughout history, whether you're looking at architecture, art, literature, what have you, reform, restoration, Renaissance has come not through novelty, but returning to our roots, kind of drawing water from the font of tradition, because it's in that tradition that all that deposit of who we are is held. And when we return to that, when we draw out of that, that is what facilitates these great periods of Renaissance. Now, obviously, I know not everything that's passed on tradition is authoritative. I obviously know that. There's many non-binding traditions within the church. Some people call them small t traditions. But I think that, this is just my opinion, the contemporary tendency seems to be to downplay the binding role of tradition rather than to emphasize it. That is, to stress the non-binding nature of things rather than stopping to think what these traditions were here for. In the modern period, if you've read a lot of modern theologians, you'll see this model kind of put forward where they will say that the church is like a ship, kind of, and the ship is like the gospel in its primitive simplicity, and then all these traditions kind of cluster on it like barnacles on the bottom of a ship, and they encrust it. And then what we need to do is kind of you can just scrape the barnacles off, and then we can get the ship back to its kind of primitive simplicity. And I've read this in several modern theologians, Congar and von Balthasar and others. But so the ship is covered in barnacles, or like metal covered in rust. So all that's necessary to bring about a new Pentecost would be, in theory, to just scrape that stuff off and get the ship in working order. But this is what happened, in fact, to architecture, art, music, because what is a barnacle? What is disposable? Is the way a church built disposable? Is the architecture disposable? Is the music disposable? The types of vestments we wear? It's really interesting when you start thinking. For example, a priest's vestments, is that disposable? Is that non-binding? Well, sure, in one level, the faith isn't going to be overthrown if the priest changes his clothes or if he goes out in street clothes. But on the other hand, the way we dress says something about how we perceive ourselves. If every priest were to start wearing street clothes all the time, very subtly there would be a reorientation of how we viewed the priesthood. And that view could touch on the essence of the faith. So, and I think that's what happened a lot with our architecture, with our music. What we thought were mere barnacles that we could just scrape off. In fact, not to say that they're more authoritative than they are, but they're more interconnected than we thought. Thomistic theology, all these things that could be jettisoned as non-binding. Maybe the distinction is too simple. Maybe the devastation we've seen in light of the experiment suggests that the model of the barnacle-covered ship is incorrect. Maybe the way our traditions adhere in the faith is more like a root system in the ground. Maybe it's more like you have a tree, and then all these traditions kind of go out, and they permeate, and there's some that are of greater or lesser importance, like any root system. But the thing is, when you have a root system around a tree, you stick that shovel in and start digging it up, you're going to damage something no matter where you hit. Hopefully you won't damage something vital. But in other words, maybe our traditions adhere in our faith in a much more integrated way than we thought, and that everything is much more interconnected. That's just something I've been reflected on. It's more integral to the whole. The whole system is intertwined. Perhaps we've erred in thinking that non-binding means simply disposable. Maybe we've underestimated the way all these things, including architecture and so on, support the edifice of the church. We know that there's no strict rule about the way a church has to be built. Actually, there are. I shouldn't say that. There's certain guidelines, but the church doesn't have an official architecture. But we also know that if you build a church, say, for example, with the altar in the center and the church as a circle around the altar, that gradually the nature of the worship starts to change on being a communal-focused event from a divine-focused event. If you don't agree with me on that, that's fine, but I believe that's been established as a fact. There's some really great books on church architecture that make these points. So these things I don't want to confuse them with the deposit of faith to say that the way a priest dresses is the faith, but they support the edifice of the faith. These traditions might be extrinsic in the sense that a fence is extrinsic to a garden, but darn, the fence keeps things out of the garden. That's the purpose of it, right? Very interesting document. Leo XIII, he wrote an encyclical called Apostolica Curae on the nullity of Anglican orders, that is, that the Anglican Church did not have valid holy orders. And he said that this was because they had defective sacramental form that came in with the changes of the Reformation. Dr. Fastigi was just talking about how the true tragedy of the Reformation was the destruction of holy orders, right? And this is what Leo XIII said. But what was really interesting in the document is the Anglicans came back and said, you are being a hypocrite because you can't even tell me, Pope, where in your holy orders the form is. We know what the matter in that sacrament is. It's the laying on of hands. But he said, you Catholics haven't even defined in your rite what words or where in those words are the form of your sacrament, but you're telling ours that it's invalid. And Pope Leo's response in that encyclical was amazing. He said, we know it's in there somewhere because this is the rite that's been passed down to us. And therefore we have confidence that somewhere within the rite, that's the form. And because I can't pinpoint exactly where it is, it's called a form in genera. That means we generally know it's in there. But he said, because I don't know exactly where it is, I ain't touching a darn thing in it. We're not going to touch it because I don't know where it's at. But I know it's in there. How do I know it's in there? Because it came down to us. A pretty astounding answer. And I think it kind of ties into this argument. I met a man who lived abroad in Europe for many years, and he told me this story. This is a true story. In France, there was this village that was at the foot of a mountain, and this happened like after World War I. And from time immemorial, this village had this custom where they'd pay boys, the village would actually pay them on the public dole to go up into the mountain and clean these caves out. There were these caves in the mountain. Every summer they'd be junked up with mud and debris and brambles and sticks, and they'd pay these boys a stipend to go clean out the cave. And it had been going on forever, like since the Middle Ages. Nobody knew why. They had no idea why they did it, but that was the tradition. So after World War I happened, the Great Depression hit, everything was really bad, and the village was looking at their budget, and they said, this really makes no sense to have these boys cleaning the caves out. We don't even, this is some medieval custom. So they cut the stipend, canceled cleaning out the caves. So not long after this, the town was suddenly hit with mudslides and floods, and a lot of things were wiped out. There'd never been anything like that in living memory in this village, and they made a prompt investigation, and they determined that the calamities had come from the mountain. And the villagers made a surprising discovery. They turned out the clearing of the caves was not pointless. Every year when the snow melted, the waters would flow down into the mountain caves, into these little rivulets and whatnot, here and there. And but when the villagers ceased clearing the debris, the passages the water normally ran through got all clogged, and the water got diverted elsewhere, came down to the village. So the annual clearing of the caves was necessary to prevent this natural disaster. Now, local historians did some research, and they found that this went back to the Roman times, to when this was a Roman colony, like 2,000 years ago, right? The Romans, who were consummate engineers, understood the relationship between the caves and the floods, and that's why they made it a matter of public expense. That's something that the city paid for to have done. Now, the Romans obviously disappeared. The medievals came. They kept doing it over the centuries. They forgot why they were doing it. Nobody knew. But they kept doing it. They forgot the rationale. As they learned, the thoughtless jettisoning of so ancient a custom proved to be disastrous in a way they had not foreseen, and even though they did not know why it was there. So it's a fascinating story, and it shows how the tradition preserves something valuable despite the fact that the villagers didn't understand its rationale. It's the best preservative available to humans. Catholic tradition preserves important elements to our faith and hands them on, and the beautiful thing about it is it's capable of doing this even if people forget the reasons. Even if you don't understand why the priest wears a cassock, even if you don't understand why a particular sign of the cross is present in the Mass, or why bells are rung at a particular time, what the incense means, even if you don't know that. Now, the beautiful thing about the Catholic faith, the resources are there to learn that, right? But let's say you didn't. It still preserves something about the faith, even if you no longer understand what it is, okay? And in this way, this tradition, guarded by God's promises, doesn't depend upon the fallible, each generation of, me explaining it right to someone, It doesn't rest on us. But if the tradition is junked, we lose the ability to preserve elements of our religion and culture and end up drifting loose. And I posit that that's what's behind a lot of what we've seen in the church. There's a lot of wonderful things happening in the church all over, but there's a lot of sad things too. And sometimes, who was it? Was it Cardinal Burke recently said last year that one got the impression that sometimes the church looked like a ship without a rudder that was just kind of drifting. Now, where faith comes in is in realizing that nothing is accidental, that what apparently are meaningless things are random drifting is in fact God's going to bring good out of everything, right? But tradition defends us from evils we might not be aware of. Okay, the cleaning of the caves was necessary to keep the village safe, even though the villagers themselves didn't understand the nature of the evil. Similarly, we have ecclesiastical traditions that are in place for the purpose of protecting us from certain deadly errors, even if modern man thinks that some of these traditions serve no practical purpose. G.K. Chesterton explained this principle in his 1929 book, The Thing, Why I Am Catholic, in the chapter entitled The Drift from Domesticity. Do you know which quote I'm about to read, Dave?
Me.
He says, quote, "In the matter of reforming things, as distinct from deforming them, there's one plain simple principle, which will probably be called a paradox. There exists in such case a certain institution or a law, let us say for the sake of simplicity a fence, or a gate erected across a road. The modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, 'I don't see the use of it, let us clear this away.' To which the more intelligent type of reformer will answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, then I'm certainly not going to let you remove it. Go away and think, and then when you can, come back and tell me if you do see the use of it, and then I may allow you to destroy it.'" End quote. In other words, this has been paraphrased, if you don't know why a fence is up, don't take it down until you know what it's there to keep out, right? I just bought a 5-acre farm. It's got a ton of fences on it. I was thinking about this quote going around. Should I pull this fence down? I don't know. What was it here to keep out or in? I don't know. I got little dogs, I got animals. Take the fence down and then next week, coyotes are in killing something. Haven't seen no coyote, but someone put the fence up for some reason. So unless I know why it's there, I'm not going to take it down. Now, so I've just been talking about tradition in general, and as I go into the last part of the talk here, talk about the traditional Latin Mass. How do we stay connected to our tradition, which is the lifeblood of the Catholic faith? Now, we could mention many things, like what Dave is doing here by just having these gatherings where people discuss things pertinent to their faith, by reading the saints, studying theology, following the advice of Cardinal Newman, who says that to be deep in history, right? That's where we should be. But remember, that book I cited, Monsignor Agius, the primary tradition of the Church is its liturgy. The traditional liturgy of the Church is known as the extraordinary form of the Mass, or the so-called Tridentine Mass. Now, if we want to plug into the tradition of the Church, I recommend attending the extraordinary form of the Mass. This is the Mass of the Saints, the same Mass attended by Teresa of Lisieux and celebrated by Padre Pio, who, after the Second Vatican Council, obtained a dispensation to continue saying this Mass that he loved so much. Even though it's not codified until the Council of Trent, it goes back to the early Middle Ages and is substantially similar to the Mass as St. Francis or St. Bernard would have seen it. In fact, the core of the Mass, the Roman canon itself, is unchanged from the time of Pope St. Gregory, and the biggest change he made was moving the position of the Our Father within the Mass. Some linguists, and I can't speak to this, but I've heard that some linguists trace aspects of the Roman canon back to the hand of St. Peter. I don't know about that, but this isn't a matter of mere historical curiosity, because we know that the Church doesn't consist of just those who happen to be walking around right now, as Chesterton says. Right? There's a Church triumphant that consists of all those who have ever lived. So if we really want to think with the Church, to think with the mind of the Church, there's no better way than to integrate the traditional Latin Mass into our spirituality, which was the Mass that the vast majority of saints and Catholics knew, loved, died for in some cases. Now, this is not to detract from any other legitimate rite of the Mass. When I lived in Europe, I went to the Ukrainian Catholic Mass. I've been to the Chaldean Mass. They all have their particular, charisms. So this isn't to detract from any other legitimate rite. But we don't want to deny that this particular Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, has had a kind of pride of place in the Church's history. So if we recognize the force of tradition, its importance in preserving the faith, we would be remiss if we didn't make this Mass an integral part of our spiritual life, just as it was for so many saints. I think, again, one of the distinctions between a traditional Catholic and maybe just a Catholic who's not is what you do with the traditional Latin Mass. For many Catholics, I like the traditional Latin Mass. I respect it. It's reverent, and I go to it sometimes. And then others, like myself, would take the position of this is actually more integral to, this is not just kind of a historical curiosity of like, well, there's all these rites and I like this one. Also, it's more of a matter of this is the key to helping restore our faith. But this is what Benedict XVI hoped for when he allowed the free celebration of the traditional Latin Mass in Summorum Pontificum in 2007. He said that he hoped this rite would enrich, that he hoped that there would be an enrichment between the ordinary form and the extraordinary form, that we would come to appreciate the riches that were contained in the Old Mass, and that it would enliven our faith in the post-conciliar period. That was what he wrote in his letter to Summorum Pontificum. So, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, but Dave called me here to pontificate, so I think the traditional Latin Mass is actually ground zero for the battle over Catholic identity today. And what we are witnessing in the church is a battle for Catholic identity. If you wonder what is going on in the church, I think that's what it is. It's a battle for identity. Will the church of the future continue her historic identity, or will she try to reinvent herself in the image of something foreign to her? Will she be uncomfortable with her traditional forms of prayer and instead turn to Eastern mysticism to fill in the gap, right? Will she be uncomfortable with her traditional music and look to, the Protestant tradition or whatever to fill in, will she look back and be, sometimes it seems like Catholic tradition is like an embarrassing, half-senile uncle that lives upstairs that you don't want your friends to see. That's the way some people seem to treat it. So we're going to take that approach, that we're kind of embarrassed by it and we got to fill it in with bringing these things in that are foreign to our own tradition? Or do we go back to the font, back to the sources, pull from the richness of our own heritage and use that as a source for renewal? It's no coincidence the religious orders and institutes that flourish today are those who integrate the traditional Latin Mass into their religious life. I wanted to mention, I don't know how familiar any of you are with the traditional Latin Mass, but I want to mention that we shouldn't think that this is bound up with, canonically irregular groups like the Society of St. Pius X. There's numerous opportunities for the traditional Latin Mass from societies and fraternities who are in good standing with the Church, like the FSSP are the most well-known, but a little gem I've discovered is a group called the Christi Pauperum Militum Ordo, the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ, who are actually the historical, or they're the canonical successors to the Templars of the Middle Ages. And they devoted to the traditional Mass, the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign, and other groups. Since Summorum Pontificum, the use of the traditional Latin Mass has been exploding all over the Western world. There's a group called Yuvan, Michigan, that is run by a great friend of mine, Paul Schultz. He's, you know him?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's Paul Schultz. Whenever I see him, I think I wish I could be as good a Catholic as he was. He walks the walk and doesn't feel like he needs to talk the talk, Whereas I'm like, blah, blah, blah. But Paul dedicates his whole life to just spreading the traditional Latin Mass, without any politics, without any nonsense, just approaching priests. Hey, we'd like to have a traditional Latin Mass in your church. We'd like to have a dance afterwards. He brings young people. You ever go to these things? It's full of young people. I mean, you go to any traditional Latin Mass, it's full of young people, because young people want reverence and transcendence. Right? They want to encounter the divine. So many more parishes are beginning to offer the extraordinary form, and I think this is the antidote. So it doesn't need to be bound up with other groups like the SSPX. Indeed, it ought not be. The goal of traditional Catholicism at this point should be to nurture a traditionalism that's truly a positive force for renewal within the Church in a manner that has nothing to do with these other groups. One of my overarching reasons in writing a traditional Catholic blog was to basically let the world know there's Catholics out there who love our tradition and are not SSPX or sedevacantists, which when I first started, it seemed like I was an island in the ocean, but then Summorum Pontificum happened and this great blossoming of the traditional Mass happened all over the Church. I pray speedily for the reconciliation of the SSPX, but my identity as a traditional Catholic, I don't feel it's bound up with them whatsoever. To close, there's a priest, Father Chad Ripperger, from the Fraternity of Saint Peter. There's two commandments, right? There's the fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother. And then there's a seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal. And he says when we willfully destroy our tradition, we break both commandments. When we destroy our tradition, we break the fourth commandment by dishonoring our fathers in the faith that labored very difficultly to pass on the tradition intact. And when we rupture it, we steal. We steal from those who will come after us, who it was given to us, and instead of passing it on, we destroy it. And we rob future generations of the ability of being able to enjoy the riches. Now, I'll tell you a story as I wrap up. When I converted to the Catholic faith, I didn't know anything about Catholicism. Somebody behind me. When I converted to the Catholic faith, I didn't know much about the current state of the church. I thought, because I'd read mainly Protestant literature, that Catholics all still worshipped in Latin. This was like 2002-ish. Hi there.
Hi, Sarah.
Oh, hi, John. There's a seat right here. Save it just for you.
Okay. So, I'd mainly been familiar with Protestant critiques of Catholicism, like, worshipping in a dead language that nobody can understand, and statues, and this and that. And so that was what I expected Catholicism to be. And when I entered the church, I thought, I don't know Latin, I better go learn it. So I went and enrolled in a Catholic liberal arts college and studied Latin for like 2 or 3 years. And then I came into the church because I just thought, God had really tugged on my heart, and I thought, well, if this is what the Church of Christ speaks, I'm going to speak it. So I started studying it. And then I came into the church, and I just kind of noticed there wasn't a lot of Latin anywhere. Like nowhere. I couldn't get, I would go to my music directors and say, can you please sing some Latin hymns? And they'd say, no, we're going to sing, these hymns by Charles Wesley or whatever, which are beautiful, but, they weren't Latin. And so I just kind of realized there wasn't any. And to speak of what Father Rippiger just said about it being a form of theft when you destroy the tradition, now instead of experiencing Latin as a living tradition that was handed on, it was a historical curiosity. It was something I read about in a book, not something that was lived, until I discovered going to the traditional Latin Mass. So there's many other things you could think of like that when when you go to Europe and you see these beautiful buildings, and then you see a new one that is of a modern design, and you wonder, like what happened? Why has this tradition been ruptured? And you feel like you've been robbed of something that could have been there, could have been handed on, but it wasn't. So it has eternal value because our tradition is nothing else than the fullness of faith, entrusted once and for all to the saints. It's everything our ancestors handed on. And I think it's the most powerful tool of evangelization we have. It's a paradox. The faith is what we want to bring people to, but the faith is also the tool we use to bring them. That's a paradox, but it's powerful. It has great power behind it. Pope Benedict XVI said that our faith, quote, is not only informative, but performative. That's from Spe Salvi. The Catholic tradition, it's like a lion. We just have to let it out of the cage. Just let it out. Let it do its thing. Right? And that's what it's done. It can take care of itself. So it's very beautiful. It's majestic, imbued with grace and power to transform lives and purify souls. And I would honestly recommend, if you don't go to the traditional Latin Mass, or you haven't recently, I know Dave said he's going for Christmas. If any of you haven't gone recently, or maybe you've gone but just as kind of a curiosity or a novelty, you went just to check it out. Maybe you couldn't follow. You didn't like that the priest wasn't saying everything out loud to where you knew exactly where he was. It takes a little while to reorient yourself to how it's offered, but I would encourage you to go and try to, instead of sitting there and saying, I don't know what's going on, let the tradition work on you, and let this is something that many, many saints were profoundly moved by. This was the source of their holiness, and that has to stand for something. So this is the value of the tradition. And that's why I personally think any authentic reform in the church should be centered on restoring our tradition, not reinventing them or reinterpreting them in anthropocentric terms for modern man, whose needs, we are told, are allegedly very different from other generations. So in conclusion, I'll quote from Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16. Thus says the Lord, stand at the crossroads and look, and ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. Thank you.